international affairs analyst Dan Perry, alongside our senior diplomatic correspondent Owen Alterman. Some options involve seizing strategic islands, striking nuclear sites. Ultimately, how risky would this be in terms of regional retaliation and global economic fallout? Obviously, part of the messaging that we're hearing here is exactly what Owen referred to. You know, Donald Trump trying to speak to Americans who are deeply concerned about the price of gas, and, obviously any more strikes to the region wouldn't necessarily help that.
I think it entails a certain risk because the Iranians, who are themselves inscrutable about as much as Trump is inscrutable, might indeed react very badly and start hitting at energy infrastructure in the region, and that would be unfortunate. You could be looking at an uncontrolled escalation. I'm a little bit of a skeptic about the idea that Trump needs so desperately to message anything to the American people. Trump doesn't need to be elected again, third-term nonsense aside. Trump needs to not lose the Senate in the midterm elections, otherwise he would be very much a lame duck as of basically November. But there's a lot of time until November, and the oil prices can go up and they can go down, and the stock market can go down and they can go up. I think he has time to play with that.
Well, we've certainly seen that happen every time he comes out with a statement, right?
Well, of course, yes, and there's all kinds of speculation about insiders making fortunes off the ups and downs of these markets soon after Trump makes a statement. Trump has been all over the place, and I suggest, honestly, in analyzing what's likely to happen, we put aside what he says and also what the Iranians say. There are two ways to look at this war. One is what the Iranians are willing to pay in order to have the world go away. And that is something I think the Americans are constantly game-theorizing about. And the other is there anything to talk to them at all about because we want the regime gone? I think Israel's more in the latter camp. And the Americans just want to see what kind of a good deal they can get. And right now, the disturbing thing is that the Iranians, at least in public, are negotiating very, very hard. And the things they're putting on the table in exchange for the various American proposals, which have been only partly reported on, and despite the contingency planning to seize Harg Island and whatever, are unbelievably radical. I mean, they want Netanyahu sent to The Hague. They want reparations for what's been damaged, and they want their sovereignty that doesn't exist to be recognized over the Straits of Hormuz so they can turn it into a toll gate. All this is crazy talk, and that suggests that they're not prepared to negotiate. Now, do we assume the Iranians are rational players? That might be a mistake, but then again, maybe it might not. Who are the Iranians? Under Khamenei, they kind of were rational players to an extent. When they were given a choice, of buying time, but giving up the nuclear file, they did that in 2015. So history suggests they are willing to do a deal, just as Trump says. However, right now, we don't really know who's in charge in Iran.
You know, I just want to briefly talk about the fact that we're seeing the bulk of Iranian attacks on Gulf Arab nations, not even the state of Israel. What do you make of that? What is the messaging here?
The Iranians wanted to shock the system, and they wanted to get the Gulfies to pressure the Americans to stop on almost any terms. They crossed the Rubicon in doing that because, of course, the Gulf nations have tried so hard to project stability and economic development, and they've attracted millions upon millions of foreign citizens to come live there. Most of the citizens of the UAE, most of the residents of the UAE, are in fact not locals. Now, their entire business model is shot if it turns out these are dangerous places that Iran can, at whim, fire at. Moreover, the Gulf nations made a deal essentially with the U.S. They gambled that the U.S. can provide them with a security umbrella that will make all this sustainable. And if it turns out that Iran can bombard them and the U.S. doesn't really react in any way that is to that, U.S. just continues business as usual, then they might feel betrayed. That was Iran's gamble. But it seems to have backfired, because if I look at what the Gulfies are saying in private and in public at this point, the Wall Street Journal op-ed by the UAE's ambassador makes very clear that they have, rather than what the Iranians hoped for, gone in the other direction, have concluded that the Iranian regime is a complete and total menace. In other words, have joined Netanyahu in his fundamental preference, not for a deal, which may be Trump's preference, but for regime change. And then the question becomes, is it attainable without boots on the ground? Is there any way to do it? Was there a deal with the military in Iran to do a coup? Stuff like that.
Well, we've seen different reactions from the Gulf. And Natasha, I do have a lot of sympathy for these leaders. They have to be very careful about the balance of power, and just as in terms of a matter of reality. And I think that's what the Iranian objective here is. Part of it is exactly what Dan said, to get these countries to cry uncle and go back to Washington and beg and plead for the United States to stop, or for that matter, for Israel to stop. But part of it is an ambition, and this is becoming more and more clear, an Iranian ambition to expand Iran's sphere of influence. The Iranians had an intuitive sense that these countries, in trying to get the balance of power right between Iran and the United States, had not gotten the balance of power right. And Iran wants to teach them a lesson and drive the point home of how they haven't gotten the balance of power right. And I think a big part of what these capitals are doing, what these leaders are doing, is frankly trying to gauge who is going to win the war and to try to calibrate their policies toward that end. And going to what you were saying, Natasha, and we heard from our guest,
right,
for all of what we've heard, and we've heard all of the right things from Israel's perspective, certainly from the UAE, still haven't put those planes in the air in order to make a contribution, even a symbolic one.
Not only the UAE, also Qatar. And this may show you how the Iranian gamble has backfired, because Qatar historically has had a foot in every camp and has been reluctant to actually, speak out against Iran, even though they do host an American base. You see even Qatar joining the other Gulf nations.
Absolutely. All right. So, obviously there's been a lot of talk about ground troops entering Iran. What would that ultimately mean for this war? We're almost a month in. How would that essentially change the equation?
Well, if the goal is to bring down the regime, that is impossible to do with merely air power. I don't think there's any precedent for that, basically. So ground troops are certainly relevant in that regard, but the U.S. isn't moving over the kind of order of battle that could achieve that. We're talking about thousands of paratroopers and so forth, and nor does the U.S. have the will, I think, to take over a country as big as Iran, which is a quagmire in the making par excellence, bigger than Iraq and Afghanistan combined, I believe. So that probably isn't going to happen. What could happen, for example, is a takeover of Harg Island. That would be devastating to Iran's oil economy, and that would not be a quagmire because it's an island. And you can absolutely take it over very quickly with a few thousand soldiers. The message would be very severe, and it would fall into the bigger picture of the bigger question of whether messaging to the Iranians can work at all. There's this multi-pronged effort to get them to understand that the game is up, that they need to give up the militias and the nukes and their dreams of spreading jihad, and maybe, just maybe, they'll be allowed to survive as an Islamic Republic regime to oppress their people another day. And they don't seem to be getting it yet because they're not seeing evidence of breaking. But who knows? The hope is that one more amazing achievement, the taking over of most of their oil export facilities, maybe that would do it. At some point, I expect to see evidence of fissures within the regime, of factions forming, and of competition between people who really want to take this to the hilt, maybe up to and including the Samson option of bringing the whole house crashing down upon themselves and destroying the country, versus those who want to more pragmatically save something and live to fight another day.